All right, well, let's take a look at the week 2 assignment where we read the Mississippi Black Codes from 1865. We watched the video segment on the Jim Crow laws, and then we read James Garfield's inaugural address from March 4th, 1881, and assessed what kind of president James Garfield would have been had he not have been assassinated just 6.5 months after becoming president. Would he have made some changes that would have positively affected conditions for black people living in the South and throughout the United States after the Civil War and after the end of Reconstruction, or not? And then we wanted to clarify and justify how we arrived at those conclusions. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the Mississippi Black Codes, because reading that document was pretty evident what was going on there, but I really want to dissect that. So I'm going to go through a series of those laws, and I'm going to translate them into basically modern day plain English. And then I'm going to talk about what the purpose and the impact was, because from some of the responses that I've seen, some of the submissions that I've seen on that assignment, I feel like some of it was missed. I've seen some people assess that they weren't all bad because it did allow them to participate in the courts to a limited extent, and also to intermarry, black marrying another black person, but not whites. So everyone acknowledges that these were bad laws, but I think some people still feel like, oh, there were some highlights in there that weren't all that bad, that actually expanded freedom. No, I just want to be clear. It's okay if you felt that way, if that was your interpretation. That's a teachable moment, because really all of these laws were very much so intended to restrict black freedom. So let's talk about it. Let's just get a basic overview on the Black Codes. The Mississippi Black Codes were a series of laws that were implemented immediately following the Civil War. We saw that the date on this document was 1865. It was during a period of presidential reconstruction, it's called. This is where President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated, and remember, Andrew Johnson was a Southern Democrat. When he took over, he rolled out his version of Reconstruction to reunite the South with the North. But Johnson was a racist, so he was not concerned about advancing civil rights for blacks. So he basically returned political control of the Southern state governments back into the hands of the racist whites, the very same racist whites who had fought on the side of the Confederacy and launched a full-scale secession and even war to keep slavery intact. They'd lost that, right? Now there was no chance to reverse the liberation of black people. However, through these laws, they would be able to limit the liberty or restrict the liberty of black people. And that's what this is all about. So that's what these laws were intended to do. Let's talk about some of them. Let's look at the first series that we read, which are the Vagrant Laws. So in Section 6, essentially what that's saying is that any black person over the age of 18 years old who was unemployed or was congregating together unlawfully, it says, either during the day or during the night, would be deemed a vagrant and fined $50 and jailed for 10 days. Likewise, any whites who were congregating with blacks, quote, on terms of equality, or were sexually involved with the black person, were going to be fined $200 and jailed for 6 months. Okay, so what's the purpose and the impact there? Section 6 was meant to revive old slave laws that made it illegal for black people to congregate together and made it illegal for a relationship to exist between a white person and a black person. Notice that the law includes nothing about a trial by jury. If a black was found to be unemployed, or a black and a white person were found to be congregating together or in a relationship together, they were automatically deemed vagrants. No trial by jury, deemed vagrants, fined, and thrown in jail. Notice also that the fines and the jail times in that law were actually higher for white people. It was up to $200 fine and up to 6 months imprisonment. Now, this was very intentional, and not because they wanted to be more lenient on blacks. It was because they wanted to threaten the livelihood of whites even more for congregating or being involved in relationships with black people. So this was meant to separate the races. They did not want them to be congregating together. And so they intended to keep them apart by levying even higher punishments on the white people to discourage them from congregating with black people or forming relationships with them. Now, in the next section, that's section 6. In section 7, the plain language on that one basically says that if and when any black person charged as a vagrant under section 6 was unable or unwilling to pay the fine that was levied against them, they would be arrested and they'd be hired out to anyone who would pay that fine in their place. And preference would be given to that black person's previous or current employer if one existed. Let's talk about the purpose and impact there. So in section 7, it further punished black people by allowing the sheriff to sell their labor to the highest bidder that would pay the vagrancy fine in their place. Now, keep this in mind, $50 in 1865 was a lot of money. It's about $750 in today's money, accounting for inflation. Now, in 1865, think about this. You just got liberated from slavery. You were a slave all your life. Not paid a wage, slave labor, not wage labor. Now, all of a sudden, you're free. Now you're trying to find work. Your economic opportunities were limited. So you get out of slavery without a penny in your pocket, right? Remember, the war officially ended in April 1865. This is already like June, July, summer of 1865. How much time have you had to make any money and save any money, right? So here's a $750 in today's value fine that's levied against you, and you've got to pay it. And if you don't pay it because you don't have the money, someone else can come in and pay it instead of you, and now they get your labor hired out to them, right? So that fine made it highly unlikely that blacks would be able to pay that off, and highly likely that as a result they would then be arrested and contracted out to work for people against their will. Notice that even though Section 6 also punished whites with fines and jail time if they congregated with black people or were in a relationship with black people, even though they were punished in Section 6, Section 7 specifically says that black people could be contracted out if they couldn't pay their fines. It does not say anything about white people having their labor contracted out if they couldn't pay their fines. So this really was a reinstated form of the auction and enslavement. All right, so very important for us to realize what they were doing here. Right? It was very manipulative. It was very intentional that their goal was to restrict black rights and black freedoms, keep the races apart, and then find a way to imprison, fine, and then eventually contract out the black labor against their will. They're essentially trying to reinstate a form of enslavement. Let's look at the next section, the civil rights of freedmen. I especially want us to look at Section 3. So in Section 3, if any black person and a white person married each other, they would be convicted of a felony and sentenced to life in prison. This law went so far as to stipulate that a black person was anyone who had a black ancestor going 3 generations back. It didn't matter if every single one of those 3 generations there was a white person as well. So black and white person, black and white person, black and white person, and you're still counted as black. Doesn't matter if you have white people, just as many white people in those 3 generations of ancestors as you do black people. You're still considered to be a black person. And in fact, even if you were born to 2 white parents, who were born to 2 white parents, who were born to 1 black parent and 1 white parent, that's still a black person in your ancestry going 3 generations back. You're still considered black. All right, so the purpose and impact of Section 3, again, was to separate whites and blacks. This was implementing and holding on to, for dear life, a racially stratified society that kept white people and black people apart. So the racism that had developed over time in the South and then up to the Civil War and then perpetuated even after emancipation was very intentional by the people in power. They wanted to keep it that way. All right. Now, it's also worth noting that even though Section 2, and this is where some people go, oh, well, maybe they weren't all bad because it did allow them to have to marry and have the same rights as long as they married another black person, right? Two black people marrying each other. Listen, here's the bottom line. They weren't allowed to marry the person of their choice necessarily, right? A black person was not allowed to marry the person they loved if that person was white. And, even if that white person wanted to marry the black person because they love them, they couldn't do it. They'd both get thrown into prison for life, right? So these were, again, further restricting the rights and privileges of free black people. Let's look at sections 5 through 7 of the Civil Rights of Freedmen. Those stated that as of January 1866, and then going on forward from there, every black person would have to be under a labor contract and would have to show proof of that labor contract. Now, if at any point a black man decided that he didn't want to work for that employer anymore, and he just left and was found to be in violation of that contract or in breach of that contract without what was considered to be good cause, it says without good cause, and we'll talk about that in a second, then he would automatically forfeit all the wages that he'd earned that year up to that point. So if he's disgruntled with his employer and he says, forget it, I don't want to work for you anymore, and he leaves and he's found to be in violation of that labor contract because the term hadn't ended yet, if he doesn't have good cause, then he is automatically forfeiting all of his wages that he already worked for that year up to that breach in his contract. And then he would still be returned to that employer and have to finish up the contract. He would still have to go back and work for that person. Here's the problem of without good cause. That's subjective, right? Who's making the determination of whether or not a black person had good cause to leave their employer? You think it's the black person? No. He has his reasons. But the authority that be, the sheriff or whoever the local authority is the one who is getting to make the determination on whether that's good cause. How often do you think that would have gone in favor of the black person, right? Not very often. He would be arrested, returned to that employer, and lost all of his wages that he'd already earned that year. All right, so the purpose and implications behind Section 5 through 7 is that obviously it was reinstating forced labor. A black person was not able to choose who they worked for and when they worked for them, when they started working and when they decided to leave. That's what we call free labor. If you don't get to choose who you work for or when you can quit, and it be completely your will, then you don't own your labor anymore. And that's forced labor, and that is enslavement. It doesn't matter if they put a little wage on it. If they're paying you a wage, but you don't have the option to leave whenever you want, and if you do, you'll be returned and you'll lose all those wages that they're paying you, that's still enslavement. Doesn't matter if there's a wage there, it's still enslavement. You're not free to dictate the terms of your own employment. Okay, so really important to know. Lastly, let's look at the section that covers certain offenses of freedmen. Section 1 and 2 just lay out a laundry list of potential offenses that could lead to the arrest and fine of a black person. And I mean, these range from having a weapon to using insulting language to functioning as a minister of the gospel without a license. And all of those offenses and all the many more that they list, you can read them in sections 1 and 2. particularly in Section 2, because Section 1 focuses on owning a weapon. But all of those potential offenses could lead to up to $100 in fines. Again, how are they going to pay that back? Right? If $50 in 1865 was essentially $750 today, now we're talking up to $100. That's $1,500 in today's money, right? So this is pricey when you don't have a living wage really that you're earning or able to save from, and up to 30 days in jail. All right, so $100 fine and up to 30 days in jail. They got 5 days to pay that fine. 5 days, that's it. And if they didn't, then any white person, it actually says any white person can come in and pay off that fine, and now they own your labor for a period of time. All right, so again, this is just about controlling black people and relegating them back to virtual enslavement, right? And I mean, essentially literal enslavement when you think about it, because even though they weren't literally enslaved, these laws, these black codes, put them into a socioeconomic condition where they had very little rights, very little control over their own economic outcomes and opportunities, and could be arrested for any type of offense, thrown in jail, and then contracted out. Okay? Now, again, I want to point our attention to the subjective nature of these offenses, right? Some of these offenses that they list are seditious speech. Who determines if a speech is seditious? Insulting gestures, language, or acts. Who determines if they were insulting? Disturbance of the peace. Who determines if they were disturbing the peace? These are all going to be determined by white people in power, right? So this essentially gave racist whites the freedom to just levy charges and fines and jail time against black people at the white person's will, and then contract that black person out to go back to work, all right? So after the end of the Civil War, when slaves were liberated, all of these Southern whites, plantation owners who made their living off agriculture, lost all of their labor, right? So these were ways to manipulate the system and force black people to be back on the plantation against their will, working for limited wages and wages that they could even revoke if the black person said, I'm fed up, I'm out of here, and left in the middle of a labor contract, okay? So this is what conditions were like. This is what life was like for black people in the South immediately after the Civil War. And it didn't get better. As Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877, the federal government basically said, all right, we're hands off. We're just moving forward now. We're focusing on the economy and on industrial output and bringing the nation back together. We're not going to enforce civil rights for black people in the South, right? So black people were left to fend for themselves to a large degree. And it just got worse with Jim Crow laws and again, racist policies that were able to perpetuate in the South. So then we asked ourselves, would James Garfield had made a difference? Because no presidents that came in the late 1800s made a difference. After the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction was basically dead in the water. These southern states run by racist whites were able to implement laws like the Black Codes that basically relegated black people back to a low socioeconomic condition with limited, very limited social and political rights. But we had a man enter office in March 1881 named James Garfield, who had been a congressman from Ohio. And in that inaugural speech, he specifically addresses the problem with racism and slavery in the South. And we had to ask ourselves, would he have made a difference, and why or why not? Look, I'll tell you this. One thing that you might not know is that James Garfield was very outspoken about black rights, very outspoken about civil rights for all Americans. And that started before he was president. So in 1865, he stood before Congress when they were trying to figure out, what do we do with, this 4 to 5 million population of new Americans, the black former slaves that had been liberated and emancipated. What do we do about them now? What do we do about their rights? How do we distribute rights? Are they going to be the same rights that white people have? This was a conversation that was being had throughout the nation, and especially in Congress. And James Garfield basically chastised his peers in Congress. And he stood up and he asked them, what is freedom? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If that is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion. And he basically was challenging his peers that just to emancipate black people was not enough, that they had to have all the same freedoms, all the same liberties, all the same rights of any other American. And he talks about this in his inaugural address. And he says that the elevation of black people from slavery to the full rights of citizenship is the most important political change that they have known since the adoption of the Constitution of 1787. And that it benefited everyone in America, everyone in the U.S. And he made it clear that it was absolutely imperative, absolutely necessary, that their rights be advanced and protected. He said of black Americans, they deserve the generous encouragement of all good men, so far as my authority can lawfully extend. They shall enjoy the full and equal protection of the Constitution and the laws. And he mentioned specifically that, because this is now the time where, these black codes were really perpetuating and black people were being prevented from being able to vote, even though it was their full right by that time. The 15th Amendment giving them the right to vote, basically prohibiting the states from preventing a black person from voting. Those federal laws were not being enforced, and the states were implementing these other kinds of manipulative laws to prevent black people from being able to access the right to vote. And he says, in many communities, Negro citizens, he says, talking about the black people, are practically denied the freedom of the ballot or the right to vote. He says to violate the freedom and sanctities of the suffrage or the right to vote is more than an evil. It is a crime, which if persisted in will destroy the government itself. Suicide is not a remedy. If in other lands it be high treason to compass the death of the king, in other words, if in other lands killing the head of state, the king, would be enough to warrant treason and a death conviction for the person who plotted it, he says it shall be counted no less a crime here to strangle our sovereign power, meaning the people, and stifle its voice. So what he's saying is that keeping the black Americans from being able to access their full political rights and privileges that the Constitution had guaranteed them, preventing them from being able to vote, was no less than high treason against the most sovereign entity in this country, which is the people, which are the American people, which includes the black Americans who had all the rights and privileges of citizenship. And in the southern states, they were stifling that voice. They were denying that. So Garfield is very outspoken. Now, this is 1881. This is not a popular stance to take. All right? Obviously, all of the Southern Democrats did not want blacks to have equal rights as whites. Many northern whites, also felt there should be some separation. It shouldn't be completely equal. And even the moderate Republicans of the North, the white Republicans of the North, who opposed the Southern Democrats in so many ways, by 1881, were just kind of ready to move on. Again, the federal government had left the South with the Compromise of 1877, and black people were left to fend for themselves. And 4 years later, in 1881, Garfield's coming in strong. And he's saying on the day that he's going into office, He calls this out as being the most important political change, absolutely necessary for the life and health of the country. So my take is he would have absolutely affected change. Now, to what extent, I don't know. Right? This is all hypothetical. To what end? Like, how long would it have lasted beyond his term in office? Who knows? But I believe that because of how important this issue was to him, both as a congressman and on the day that he was elected, or inaugurated into presidential office, when it was not popular at all to necessarily take that stand. And I shouldn't say at all, because obviously abolitionists, and there were plenty of whites that did advocate for equal civil rights for all Americans, whites and people of color. But a lot of people in America, a lot of whites, did not see this as like the popular stance. And yet he took it anyway. And he was very clear about it. So I think he would have taken action. I think when he says that so far as my authority can lawfully extend, they, being black people, shall enjoy full and equal protection of the Constitution and the laws, I think he meant that. Unfortunately, he was inaugurated on March 4th. He was shot in July 2nd, I believe. And after 2 months of complications, he finally succumbed to his wound and died. So we will never know, but I think that America was robbed of a great president, and the African American population, the black Americans who were newly emancipated and were trying to find opportunity, were robbed of someone who might have been able to advance their cause and advance the cause of civil rights for all Americans when Garfield took a bullet from the assassin.